The weight of my son's body was heavier than it should have been, as if fever had fused his bones with mine. His skin burned against my chest, damp with sweat, his small hand clutching my shirt with the desperation of someone who already knew the world was slipping. His breaths came shallow, each one like the snap of a match burning down to its end. I held him tighter, rocking in the dim glow of the living room lamp, whispering promises I wasn't sure I had the strength to keep. And while his life ebbed in my arms, my wife was laughing with another man. I knew because I had seen the photos she posted, the glittering rooftop penthouse, champagne glasses raised against the city skyline. She called it a work gala, but I knew the smile she wore in that picture wasn't professional. It was the kind of smile she used to give me, before I became a shadow beside her radiance. The divide between us was always there. I was a middle-class man who measured time in paychecks and grocery lists, while she measured hers in designer shoes and invitations scrawled in gold foil. I tried to bridge that gap for years, to play the part of the stable husband she could bring home like a loyal accessory. But money has a way of shaping people's appetites, and her hunger was never satisfied with what I could provide. The air smelled of children's Tylenol and damp sheets. My phone lay silent beside me, messages unanswered. I had begged her to come home earlier, just one text, "He's worse. Please." Hours passed, no reply. When she finally answered, it was a single word, busy. Busy, while I sat drenched in my child's sweat, pressing cool clothes to his forehead, counting each faltering breath. Busy, while I watched the rise and fall of his chest and prayed I wouldn't have to explain to a coroner why his mother wasn't here. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear her. Heels clicking against marble floors, the pop of a cork, the low rumble of his voice. Her first love. The one she used to tell me about with nostalgia, before she realized I wasn't him. Rich, confident, cruel in the way only men who've never been denied can be. He had always been in the background, an unspoken ghost between us, and now he was flesh again, claiming what was his in her eyes. The first time I smelled that unfamiliar cologne clinging to her dress, I convinced myself it was just the residue of some stranger she brushed past. The second time, when I noticed the silk gown tucked into the back of the closet with a faint wine stain at the hem, I told myself she deserved something frivolous after months of stress. The third time, the perfume on her wrist, the diamond bracelet she claimed was on loan, I stopped lying to myself. I knew. But suspicion is a slow poison. It seeps, corrodes, then waits until the moment you're weakest before revealing the blade. It was close to midnight when the iPad buzzed beside me on the couch. I hadn't touched it all evening. It was hers, a sleek tablet she used for work. I might have ignored it, but the screen lit up in the dark, a message preview bright against the silence. My son stirred weakly in my arms, and I shifted to rock him. My eyes caught the words before I had time to look away. Tonight was perfect. She'll never know what we're planning. I want more. The name at the top of the message wasn't mine. The iPad hummed again, another line appearing, this time with a photo attached. Their faces, so close, lips parted, her eyes glazed with something I hadn't seen directed at me in years. And just like that, in the quiet of my living room, with my child fading in my arms, I realized she hadn't simply betrayed me, she had abandoned us both, long before the fever ever came. I was never born into luxury. My earliest memories smell of engine oil and fried eggs, the tang of grease from my father's repair shop seeping into everything we owned. My clothes came from clearance racks, my shoes were always a size too big, meant to last a year, maybe two. We weren't poor, not exactly, but every dollar was weighed before it was spent, and every indulgence carried the guilt of sacrifice. I grew up knowing the price of things before I understood their worth. That upbringing forged me into something practical, dependable. I wasn't brilliant, not gifted in the way that draws headlines, but I worked harder than anyone else in the room. College was a privilege I clawed toward with scholarships and night shifts, writing papers under buzzing fluorescent lights in the back of a grocery store break room. By the time I'd earned my degree, I thought I had beaten the odds stacked against me. That was when I met her. She belonged to a different world, marble foyers, silver cutlery, weekends in Napa. Her voice carried the kind of ease people develop when they've never had to count change at a gas station. She dazzled me, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, her smile lit up every room she entered, but because she seemed to choose me. She could have had anyone, and yet she reached for the boy from the oil-stained garage. At first, I believed it was love that bound us. Maybe it was. We collided in that intoxicating way opposites do, she brought me into her orbit of champagne brunches and glittering parties, and I grounded her in late-night takeout and long walks through places money couldn't buy. I remember thinking, this is balance. This is what people mean when they talk about two halves making a whole. But balance has a way of shifting when responsibility enters the equation. When our son was born, I thought she'd settle into the kind of love that doesn't glitter but endures. Instead, she seemed restless, as though motherhood was a cage she hadn't agreed to. While I stayed awake to rock our crying infant, she slipped away into nights with friends. When bills piled up, hospital visits, formula, daycare, she looked at me with thinly veiled disappointment, as if stability was somehow a failure. I began to notice the little things, those hairline cracks that deepened with time. Her business trips grew more frequent, though I could never get a clear description of what business required: designer gowns and red-lipped smiles. She rolled her eyes when I spoke about overtime shifts, as though working harder was proof of weakness rather than grit. She dropped the name of her first love in conversation like it was an inside joke, a fond nostalgia I wasn't privy to. "He always knew how to make me laugh," she'd say, and though I smiled back, something bitter lodged in my throat. I told myself she just missed a carefree life, that the weight of middle-class reality was pressing too hard against someone raised in silk. I thought, maybe if I worked more, saved more, planned more, she would see the worth in the life we were building. But I was wrong. To her, struggle wasn't noble, it was distasteful. She was born into comfort, and comfort was the only language she spoke fluently. The distance between us widened until silence became the third occupant in every room. At dinners, she scrolled through her phone while I cut our son's food into pieces. At night, she slipped into bed smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. When I asked, she'd laugh, say I was paranoid, kiss me in a way that tasted like pity. And each time, I swallowed my doubts because the alternative, that she was betraying us, was too heavy to face. Grief has a way of sharpening perception, though. Holding our fevered child, knowing she wasn't there, knowing she had chosen champagne flutes over thermometers, tore away the last of my denial. The iPad message confirmed what I'd buried for months. But there was one more cut waiting for me. It came quietly, 2 nights after the message, when exhaustion drove me to search for her laptop charger in our bedroom. The charger wasn't there, but something else was, a photo tucked between the pages of an old planner. It slipped free when I lifted it, landing face up on the carpet. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked younger, freer, her hair styled in a way she hadn't worn since our early days. Beside her, his arm draped around her waist, was the man I'd only ever known through her stories, her first love. His smile was smug, triumphant, as though he knew the photograph was more than a memory, it was a promise fulfilled. The date scrawled on the back stopped my breath. It wasn't from years ago. It was recent, taken while our son was already ill, while I was racing between doctors and pharmacies, while I begged her to come home. And there she was, captured in glossy permanence, glowing in another man's arms while our child faded in mine. I thought the photo was the bottom of the pit. I thought nothing could cut deeper than seeing her smiling in his arms while our son's body burned with fever against mine. But betrayal is never satisfied with a single wound, it festers, multiplies, digs in where it hurts most. The morning after I found the photo, I went through our joint bank account. Not because I wanted proof I already had, but because some part of me needed to see how far the rot had spread. The numbers didn't lie. Thousands missing, drained in neat little increments. Withdrawals that didn't match groceries or bills or daycare. Instead, payments to luxury hotels, private clubs, designer boutiques in neighborhoods where I'd never set foot. My hands trembled as I scrolled, the hospital bracelet on my wrist clinking against the keyboard. While I argued with insurance over medication coverage, she was buying silk dresses that cost more than a month of rent. While I rationed gas to stretch paychecks, she was sailing on his yacht, champagne froth spilling over her laugh. I could see it so clearly in my head, her slipping out of an Uber in the dark, heels clicking against marble, his hand at her back as the doors opened to velvet booths and glittering lights. I imagined her head tilting back, throat bare as she laughed at some joke I would never be witty enough to make. And then I imagined myself in the fluorescent-lit hospital room, slumped in a chair with our son's tiny hand curled around my finger. The monitors beeped in uneven rhythm, the air smelled of disinfectant and antiseptic soap. I hadn't showered in days. My shirt was stained with formula, sweat, and tears. I was a man unmade, while she was reborn in someone else's world. The contrast hollowed me out. Sleep became something foreign, replaced by obsessive inventory, the hours I spent beside our son versus the hours she spent gone. The dollars I scraped together versus the thousands she poured into nights that erased me. The love I gave versus the love she squandered. My grief calcified into fury, but fury had nowhere to go. Hospitals don't take rage as payment. Doctors don't prescribe vengeance as medicine. So I swallowed it, letting it curdle inside until it turned into something sharper. The first time I broke down, it was in the bathroom down the hall from my son's room. I pressed both palms against the sink and looked at myself under the fluorescent light. My reflection startled me, sunken eyes, stubble growing wild, skin gray from exhaustion. I didn't look like a father anymore, I looked like a ghost. My chest tightened, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My hands clawed at the porcelain, my knees buckled. I slid to the floor, muffling sobs into my sleeve because grief is humiliating when you're alone. I thought of her then, her hair glinting under club lights, her lips pressed against his. I thought of the photo, the date scrawled on the back. And the humiliation became unbearable. I wasn't just losing my son, I was being erased from my own family, written out of the script of my life by the woman who vowed to stand beside me. It was during one of those nights, delirious with exhaustion, that I overheard it. I had left the hospital briefly to grab coffee, the kind of sludge that passes for fuel when sleep is a luxury. The cafe was crowded, full of chatter that blurred together, until one sentence sliced through like glass. "She's back with him, you know," a woman's voice whispered, sharp with gossip. I froze, cup halfway to my lips. Her friend chuckled. "I saw them at the marina last week. They looked inseparable. Honestly, I think she's done with her husband. Poor guy doesn't even know." My stomach lurched. The world tilted, sound faded to a low ringing. They didn't notice me standing there, didn't see how their casual cruelty landed like a death sentence. "Word is," the first one continued, lowering her voice, "they're making it official soon. She's talking about leaving him, something about not wanting to wait around after, well, you know." A pause. A knowing sigh. "After the funeral." The words fell heavy, final. I gripped the counter, nails biting into the wood. My chest was hollow, my coffee forgotten. They spoke of my son's funeral as if it were already written, as if his death was a scheduled event. Worse, they spoke of her, my wife, already planning her escape, her next chapter, while mine hadn't even closed. That was the moment everything inside me fractured. Up until then, I had been clinging to the lie that she might still come back, that once she realized what she'd abandoned, she would choose us again. That hope kept me tethered to sanity. But hearing strangers speak of my marriage as a foregone conclusion, hearing whispers that she was preparing to leave before the earth even closed over our son, that snapped the last thread. I staggered out of the cafe, the cold air slicing my lungs. My thoughts spiraled, colliding in a storm I couldn't stop. She wasn't just betraying me. She was erasing me, rewriting herself into a story where I didn't exist. Where she emerged free, radiant, unburdened, while I was left as nothing more than a footnote, the husband who couldn't keep his wife, the father who couldn't save his child. And for the first time, the grief didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. Because if she thought she could bury me alongside our son, she hadn't understood the man she married. Grief makes you reckless at first, then patient. Once the crying stops, once the collapse is complete, what's left is something harder than bone. That's where I found myself, not healed, not whole, but sharpened. The night after I overheard the women at the cafe, I went home and stood in my son's room. The walls were still painted pale blue, the shelves lined with toys he was too weak to play with anymore. The mirror above his dresser had cracked weeks ago when I slammed the door too hard in frustration. The jagged fracture split my reflection in two, one half hollow-eyed, the other shadowed, darker. I couldn't look away. It became a symbol, that mirror, my grief on one side, my resolve on the other. Every time I passed it, I reminded myself, pain could either bury me, or it could guide my hand. So I began to plan. The first step was documentation. She thought she was clever, hiding purchases beneath vague transaction labels, but money leaves fingerprints. I downloaded every bank statement, printed them in neat stacks, and highlighted each theft in bright yellow. Designer names, hotel chains, yacht rentals, lines of evidence bleeding across the page. Every dollar stolen from our future became a weapon in my arsenal. Next came proof of the affair. The iPad was a treasure chest she hadn't bothered to lock. Messages flowed freely, photos, voice notes, plans disguised as business meetings. I screenshotted everything, saving each file to a cloud drive she didn't know existed. Her laughter with him, her whispered promises, her contempt for me written out in cold text. He's so pathetic. I feel nothing when I look at him anymore. Every word she thought was private became mine to wield. But proof wasn't enough. Proof is static. Strategy requires movement. I needed to know where she went, who she trusted, what mask she wore in public. So I followed her. Not openly, not like a jealous husband, but quietly, methodically, blending into the background like I'd done my entire life. Middle-class people are invisible in places like hers. No one questions the man bussing tables, the janitor sweeping the lobby, the rideshare driver waiting at the curb. I became all of them in turn, watching her glide through velvet booths and glass doors, always with him at her side. I took notes. What time she left, how much she drank, who lingered too close. The details built themselves into a map in my mind. Her world, lavish and careless, orbiting around the same handful of gilded spots. A pattern emerged. They weren't just reckless, they were predictable. It was almost funny, in a way. She left me because she thought I was ordinary, unremarkable. Yet it was my ordinariness that became my weapon. She had grown so used to being seen, to performing, that she never considered the power of being unseen. The shattered mirror reminded me daily, I wasn't the man she thought she could discard. I was the man she underestimated. The more I tracked, the clearer the imbalance became. She flaunted her excess without hesitation, assuming her world was untouchable. But I came from a world where every mistake cost dearly, where you learn to cover your tracks or face the consequences. I knew how to be careful. She didn't. Her recklessness left breadcrumbs everywhere. Drunken selfies posted minutes after they were taken. Receipts crumpled in her car. Jewelry boxes left open with gifts I hadn't bought. Each detail was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. Still, something gnawed at me. Proof of her betrayal was one thing, but if I wanted to destroy her completely, I needed more than evidence. I needed leverage. Something that could topple not just her, but the man she clung to. That's when I found it. It came not from her directly, but from him. While combing through her iPad messages, I noticed a thread where he sounded frantic. Not romantic, not playful, afraid. Words like leverage, exposure, and board members can't know appeared in fragments. At first, I didn't understand. Then I dug deeper. A quick search of his name, tied to his company, revealed whispers of controversy, misused funds, questionable investments. Nothing public yet, but close enough that a scandal could spark with the right nudge. He wasn't untouchable. He was vulnerable. And that was when the pieces locked into place. She thought she had traded up, leaving behind the weight of my modest life for the glitter of his. But she had shackled herself to a man with far more to lose than either of us. His empire rested on reputation, and reputations are fragile things. I stood in front of the shattered mirror again that night, watching my two selves stare back at me, the grieving father, and the avenger rising from his grief. My reflection asked the question I'd been circling for days. Was I willing to burn them both to the ground? The answer was already written in the cracks. Revenge isn't fire, it's ice. It doesn't burn hot and quickly, it freezes, hardens, and waits until the weight of it fractures the surface clean through. That's how I moved. Not in rage, but in calculation. The first strike was public. She invited me to one of their charity galas, as though I still served a purpose beyond embarrassment. I wore the same suit I'd worn to our wedding, though it hung looser now. She stepped out in a backless gown, glittering like she belonged to another planet. He was there too, shaking hands, laughing too loud, his arrogance filling the marble hall. When the speeches began, I slipped away to the AV booth. Weeks of preparation had led to this moment, an encrypted USB, a set of files, and a timed presentation cued into the slideshow. While the crowd clinked glasses, the screens flickered. First came the photos, her curled against him in hotel beds, her lipstick smeared across his cheek, her messages whispering, I can't stand him anymore. You're the only one I want. Gasps rippled across the room like a wave. Then came his financial records, the screenshots, the bank transfers routed through shell accounts, the whispers of embezzlement I had pieced together. The room erupted. Phones lit up, people muttered, cameras flashed. She stood frozen, her mouth parted in horror, while he turned on her with a look of pure venom. In that instant, they were no longer lovers, they were liabilities. I walked out before the chaos peaked. That was phase 1. Phase 2 was financial. With the documents I'd collected, I made anonymous submissions. The SEC, journalists, even a rival board member I knew had been circling for blood. His accounts froze within days. Properties flagged for investigation. Deals collapsed overnight. She had tethered herself to his wealth, and now that wealth was evaporating, her own lifeline went with it. I thought that would be enough, to watch them implode under the weight of their own greed. But vengeance has a way of uncovering more rot when you peel back the layers. The twist came from a manila envelope slid under my door. No return address, no explanation. Inside, hospital records. My son's records. Scrawled notes, amended forms, and one glaring annotation, treatment delayed at parental request. I read the line over and over, disbelief choking me. She had called to reschedule appointments. She had downplayed symptoms. The timing lined up with her trips, her excuses. My son's suffering had been a convenience for her, a way to free herself from obligation long enough to slip into another man's bed. That knowledge didn't just shatter something in me, it annihilated it. What was left wasn't grief, or even anger, but a clarity so sharp it cut everything else away. She hadn't only betrayed me. She had betrayed him, our child. And for that, no punishment could be too severe. The private investigator was unexpected. He found me after the gala fallout, cornering me in the hospital cafeteria where I still went out of habit, even after the monitors fell silent. "You've been busy," he said, dropping a folder on the table. Inside were surveillance shots of her and him, not the glossy public photos, but candid ones, arguments, secret meetings, envelopes exchanged. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Let's just say you're not the only one they've burned. She hired me once, years ago, to dig into his other women. Guess what? He's got a whole collection. Mistresses, escorts, even one of her so-called friends. She buried the files when she decided to take him back. Thought you might know how to use them. I did. I leaked the mistress photos next. Not to the press, no, that would have been too easy, but directly to her. Anonymously. She opened her inbox one morning to find the man she'd sacrificed her family for entangled with others, his loyalty as counterfeit as hers. By then, the social implosion was well underway. Friends whispered, invitations vanished, allies disappeared. Her name turned toxic in the circles she once worshipped. She tried to call me, dozens of times. I never answered. Let her choke on silence the way I once did. And still, the cracks widened. Because as the walls closed in, I realized something she hadn't. She needed him more than he needed her. He had money, power, and a lifetime of indulgence to shield him. She had nothing left but his shadow. And when men like him feel cornered, they cut off the dead weight first. I knew it was coming before she did. That's why the timing mattered. That's why the final strike had to be perfect. The funeral was set for a gray morning, the kind where even the sky looks hollow. She hadn't asked to attend. Perhaps shame kept her away, or perhaps she feared facing the reflection of what she had abandoned. But I knew she would come, not for him, not for me, but for appearances. She couldn't resist the optics of tragedy. That was where I would end it. Standing over my son's casket, I felt the weight of both halves of myself, the grieving father and the avenger, meld into one. I had orchestrated humiliation, financial ruin, social destruction. But the final blow, the one that would erase her mask forever, had to fall in the place she least expected, where innocence lay buried. So as mourners whispered prayers, as her heels clicked across the cemetery gravel, as his car idled at the gate, I triggered the last phase. Not noise, not spectacle, something colder. Because revenge doesn't end with exposure. It ends with obliteration. The funeral ended in silence, the kind that lingers long after the last handful of earth hits the casket. People left in clusters, whispering condolences they didn't mean, their eyes darting between me and her. She had arrived late, deliberately, dressed in black silk and dark glasses as if a costume could disguise guilt. He hadn't come at all. That, I think, was the first cut she hadn't expected. She thought he'd stand beside her, that the man she had gambled everything on would hold her hand through the performance of grief. But by then his empire was already collapsing, frozen accounts, board members sharpening their knives, mistresses crawling out of the shadows I'd lit for them. He abandoned her the way she had abandoned us, because men like him always do when loyalty costs too much. When she realized he wasn't coming, something in her cracked. Not loudly, not in tears or shouts, but in a small, shuddering exhale that I heard across the gravesite. For the first time in years, she looked small. Not glamorous, not untouchable, just hollow. Her friends didn't gather around her. They avoided her, afraid of the contagion of scandal. Once, she was the axis of their glittering circle. Now, she was radioactive. Whispers followed her down the cemetery path, pity curdled with contempt. I should have felt satisfaction, but what washed over me wasn't triumph. It was something colder. Watching her stumble under the weight of her own ruin didn't bring my son back. It didn't erase the fever that consumed him while she laughed on a yacht. Justice was never meant to be sweet, it was meant to be final. When the mourners dispersed, she lingered, clutching her designer bag like a lifeline. She tried to meet my eyes once, but I didn't give her the dignity of recognition. There was nothing left between us. No love, no hatred, no thread strong enough to tether me to her anymore. Only the echo of what she had destroyed. I stayed until the cemetery emptied. I wanted silence. I wanted stillness. I wanted to look down at that grave and know that one chapter had ended, even if I hadn't chosen the way it closed. The grass would grow over him, the stone would bear his name, and the world would move on. But I wouldn't. Not really. And yet, I walked away, not broken, not healed, but changed. Scarred in ways no one could see, resolute in a way no one could shake. She had thought betrayal would erase me, but in the end, it forged me into something she could never control. Her world was gone, wealth drained, reputation shredded, love abandoned. Mine was gone too, but I had built something from the wreckage, clarity. I knew who I was now. Not her husband. Not her shadow. Not the man begging for scraps of affection. I was the one who buried the illusion, the one who made sure she could never escape what she had done. The sky was gray as I left the cemetery, clouds heavy but refusing to break. It felt fitting. No sunlight, no absolution, just the weight of everything that had been lost. I didn't look back. There was nothing left behind me worth seeing. As I stepped through the gate, the words came unbidden, heavy but true, a final verdict spoken only to myself. I buried more than my child that day. I buried the last piece of myself that ever loved her.